Poetry in the Victorian era. The Victorian era was a period of time full of growth and changes, being the most important of them the reign of Queen Victoria. The Victorian era started with the crowning of Queen Victoria and ends with her death. Queen Victoria ascended to the throne when she was only 18 years, and she reigned for nearly 64 years. Queen Victoria had at her time the longest reign that the United Kingdom had ever seen. United Kingdom became the first world power due to the prosperity of its economy and the extent and importance of its colonial empire. London became the perceived center of Western civilization by the middle of the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution contributed to the emergence of the middle class. However, the prosperity of middle class unfortunately led to the intolerable conditions for the poor. 1/4 of England was in poverty. Poor families' children were forced to work so they could help their families bringing some extra money. Children also had to work an average of 12 hours a day, even when they were only 3 years old. They were paid very little and they were usually used as slaves for their families. Religion. During the Victorian era, people were so religious. At that time, Christianity was the major religious belief. The Anglican Church was the most powerful. Its basis was the Bible, and its purpose is to show the nation how to put the Bible's teachings into practice in everyday life. Religious movements. Evangelicalism. It was formed by a Protestant group. The minority of evangelicals in the Church of England led the missionary movement in the colonies, advocated a Puritan moral code, and published theological books, novels, and poems. Literature. The representation of a social world in realistic detail describes the subject of most Victorian poems. Victorian poetry encompassed themes such as patriotism, religious faith, science, sexuality, and social reform. Topics like events only in the contemporary age, an Italian murder story, amorous romance depicted in epistolary form wouldn't have been appropriate for a Victorian poem. Experimentation in such areas of poetic expression as the use of visual images to represent the emotion, sound as a means to express meaning, perspective as in the dramatic monologue, characterize Victorian poetry and allow Victorian poets to represent psychology in a different way. Novel was the dominating literary genre during the Victorian era. Many women writers come out of the Victorian era, such as Jane Austen, Emily Bronte, Charlotte Bronte, Matthew Arnold, Charles Dickens, and Elizabeth Browning regularly published their work in periodicals. Reform Acts. The first Reform Act. The Reform Bill of 1832 extended the vote on parliamentary representation to the lower middle classes. Second Reform Act. It extended the right to vote to settled male tenants, a person who occupies land or property rented from a landlord. The Third Reform Act. It gives the right to vote to most peasants. Women didn't have the right to vote until 1918, when it was given to women over 30. The right to vote for both men and women was equalled in 1928. Women had a few rights. In 1857, they were allowed to get divorced, keeping the money she gained from her job and having custody of their children. In 1878, they were allowed to go to the university. Acts such as the Second Reform Bill, the Custody Act, the Married Women's Property Rights Acts were passed during the Victorian era. Science and Technology. Darwinism. Charles Darwin published a work on natural selection in the middle of the Victorian era. His theory opposed the conventional way of thinking at that time, due to the fact that many scientists were Christian men who believed in God and creationism. Theory of evolution contributed to Victorians' feeling that species evolved from lower species rather than from a highest power like God. Thanks to the improvement of working families' living conditions, health systems and medical advances began to evolve, causing revolutionary changes in the fields of medicine such as X-rays, anesthesia, aspirin, vaccine, anatomy, Charles Darwin's theory of the origin of species, etc. Thanks to the Industrial Revolution, technology started to develop. Many people had great ideas to create inventions that helped improving the conditions on which Victorian people lived, such as the telephone, light bulb, sewing machine, gas engine,